In my previous video, I talked about the beginning of psychology as a science, specifically with the beginning of the school of thought known as structuralism. Well, right away, people objected to the basic ideas in structuralism. In particular, the idea that mental processes or thinking could be broken down into component parts, into basic parts. So I'm going to talk about some of the key figures in the history of psychology who had specific objections to this idea of breaking thought processes into parts. Now, one big name is William James. William James was an American psychologist, well known for giving very entertaining and dynamic lectures. And he believed it was impossible to break consciousness into individual elements. And he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the big voices saying, no, maybe this isn't how we should go about studying how we think, how we perceive our world. And so he is known for another school of thought known as functionalism. Functionalism has that word function right in its title. James was interested in the function, the purpose of things we do as human beings. You know, if we think or act a particular way, there's got to be a function, there's got to be a purpose, there's got to be something about that that is useful to us. And James was very influenced by a somewhat new idea at the time, because we're talking about the late 1800s here. You might know from previous other classes that you might have taken that the late 1800s was also a time where people were hearing about Darwin's ideas about natural selection. Evolution and natural selection, the idea that certain characteristics are passed on within a species because they help with survival, or they are adaptive, or they help, having them is advantageous to the survival of the species in some way. Well, it's not just applicable to physical characteristics. You know, the idea that perhaps the giraffe evolved a long neck because it was selected for, because having a longer neck meant you could reach the food that was higher and you survived, you know, but neck length is one thing that can be influenced by natural selection. But what about our thought processes? What about how we perceive the world? What about certain actions that we engage in? Could they be selected for? Well, people like William James did believe so. And other people after him have also continued this idea. And so there was a survival advantage, that certain characteristics, including behavioral characteristics, are more likely to be passed along to subsequent generations, and then they are selected over time. Now, another figure in the history of psychology who had objections to sort of the core ideas of structuralism is a German, right, named Max Wertheimer. I believe I pronounced that correctly. I apologize to any German or German proficient viewers who are thinking, no, you did not. But at the very least, I know the W is pronounced as a V. My German ancestors would be so ashamed of me. I never learned the language. And so Wertheimer, he believed that the acts of sensing and perceiving could not be broken into component parts or basic parts and still be understood. He believed that it was important to look at the big picture, or the whole of thinking or experience or sensation and perception. And so, you know, he uses the example that to see a house, you can't just focus on the parts, you know, the windows and the doors. You have to look at the whole thing to see what's going on there. And so Wertheimer is associated with a school of thought known as Gestalt or Gestalt Psychology. I'm not entirely sure of the correct pronunciation. Feel free to come in the comments and let me know what the correct pronunciation is. And so I'm going to say Gestalt. Gestalt translates roughly to whole or form. So one saying that's associated with Gestalt psychology is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You can't just figure out the parts of something and then add those up together to figure out what's going on in the big picture. You have to step back and look at the big picture, the whole process, the whole product, to get an understanding of how we're thinking, what we're doing, how we accomplish human actions, behaviors, and thoughts. All right. So those are two big names who were huge opponents to structuralism. Another important thing to know about the history of psychology is that, we've been talking about a lot of big names that were men, common thing. When you talk about earlier stages of a science, you very often see that the big names are men, maybe with a few women sprinkled in here and there. Well, we do have some women who were key early figures in the field of psychology, and that will be in the next video.